What arguments do those who believe that September 11th was a self-attack have? Why are the supposed leaked audios of the unfortunate passengers being questioned? Was the area where the Twin Towers were built marked by tragedy long before that terrible day? What is known about the controversial capture and subsequent assassination of Osama bin Laden? Who benefited from this whole dark scheme? Was the pursuit of justice just an excuse to take control of areas with exclusive access to oil? To answer these and other questions, let's dive into this special about the Twin Towers. The idea of this report is to tell the official version and contrast it with the evidence that has emerged in recent years. To present all the evidence so that you can draw your own conclusions. Obviously, this is a topic that has many theories going around, many different angles. We chose some to put together this story, but obviously you must have others as well. And I invite you to write them down below and share your point of view and tell us what you think about it. If you're interested in these topics, I also invite you to write the word conspiracy down below in the comments. If over 500 people write conspiracy, are we going to make a second part or another similar video that you suggest? We remind you that you have exclusive videos for channel members. To join, you have to click the button that says join down below and you'll have access to all those videos. Let's get started. In the first months after September 11th, thousands of internet forum users, independent journalists, and skeptical academics began exchanging information, comparing documents, and gathering testimonies that didn't fit with the official narrative crafted by the United States. That's how what would later be known as the September 11th Truth Movement was born, a diverse community that questioned the government's reports and proposed alternative theories. One of the most influential materials was the documentary Loose Change by Dalen Avery. This work, although questionable to many, was distributed in a nearly homemade way and massively shared on platforms like Google Video and later YouTube, becoming a cultural phenomenon. There, hypotheses were raised about explosives in the towers, the impossibility of a plane hitting the Pentagon, and the alleged complicity of intelligence agencies. For many young people of that time, it was the first time they faced a reality in which those in power sought to manipulate the masses, exploiting a terrible tragedy. But let's not jump to conclusions. Many people think that a dark omen already hung over the Twin Towers long before they were built. Yes, that's what you're hearing. Let's go back to 1905, the year Lawrence Wynn was born, a man whose destiny would indirectly become intertwined with the origin of these two emblems of the American spirit. A millionaire lawyer, philanthropist, and passionate about his hometown, New York, Wynn was also the owner of the Empire State Building, a giant whose supremacy would soon be threatened. From the first sketches of the World Trade Center, the project faced problems. In September 1962, when Minoru Yamasaki was appointed as the architect in charge of shaping the ambitious plan, voices of opposition arose. Several business organizations appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, arguing that the enormous structures, with their colossal scale, could ruin the city's small and medium-sized businesses. Among the opponents was Wynn himself, concerned not only about the economic impact, but also about the symbolic blow that construction work began in 1966. Meanwhile, public opinion was torn between fascination and fear. That same year, an architecture critic published a memorable article warning about the World Trade Center. This could mark a new era of skyscrapers or become the world's largest tombs. Wynn, determined to highlight the dangers, financed an almost full-page ad in the New York Times, warning about the risks that having two towers of such height would pose to air traffic. His argument was based on a tragic precedent, an accident that occurred in 1945 when an American bomber, blinded by fog, crashed into the Empire State, killing 11 people. Inside the building and the entire crew of the plane, Wynn's announcement included an image that was both unsettling and ominous. A plane approaching the new towers, anticipating the possibility of an imminent catastrophe. Despite the warnings, the World Trade Center was inaugurated on April 4, 1973, becoming the tallest building in the world, exceeding the Empire State by only 1.22 meters, making it clear the story of blind rivalries ended there. The structural engineering company overseeing the project defended the safety of the complex, assuring that dozens of studies showed that an aerial impact would cause minimal and localized damage, capable of being contained. Over the years, the towers became an icon of New York and an essential postcard image. Security was never absolute, and a sense of foreboding always followed them. The fires that occurred led to the installation of sprinklers on every floor, and the bomb threats, like the one in 1977, carried out by a Puerto Rican independence group, which caused a dramatic evacuation. Did they keep the fear alive? In March of 1979, the Pakistani airline Pakistan International Airlines published an ad in newspapers and magazines in the United States about its flights to New York, highlighting that they could make the trip in just 17 hours. The strange thing was, in the ad you could see the shadow of a huge passenger plane cast over the Twin Towers. Knowing the future, seeing that image is something that chills your blood. 2 years later, in 1981, an Aerolíneas Boeing 707 almost collided with the giant antenna on the North Tower. And in 1993, the attack in the parking lot of Tower 1 made it clear that the towers were no longer invulnerable. Finally, in 1999, the so-called Operation Planes would begin, marking the prelude to the ultimate tragedy. The worst-case scenario that Lawrence Wien had imagined decades earlier was finally coming true. The fatality that always seemed to lurk in the shadows of these giants of steel and glass was about to descend upon them inexorably. The morning of September 11, 2001 began like any other. In New York, the sky was a clear, almost unreal blue, and the city was bustling with its usual rhythm. Thousands rode the subway to Manhattan. Cars were clogging the bridges and tunnels, and the streets of the financial district were already full of workers entering their offices. It was just another day in the economic capital of the world, until at 8:46 in the morning, the routine was shattered. In an instant, an American Airlines Boeing 767 Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center, between the 93rd and 99th floors. At first, many believed it was a plane accident. Television networks began broadcasting live images of one of the towers smoking, while firefighters and police rushed to the area. The size of the hole in the building's facade, the black smoke rising into the clear sky, and the pieces of debris falling onto the streets already spoke of an unprecedented tragedy. While the city was trying to understand what had happened, at 9:03, another plane, United Airlines Flight 175, crashed directly into the South Tower, between the 76th and 85th floors. At that moment, it was clear the United States was under attack. The images of the second impact were broadcast live and became etched in the memories of millions of people around the world. Within minutes, the heart of the city turned into a zone of chaos. Thousands of people tried to escape from the buildings by going down crowded stairways. Meanwhile, others, trapped on the upper floors, made desperate calls to their families or asked for help through 911. The flames spread quickly, and some of those trapped were forced to make the most desperate decision: to jump into the void. The images of those people falling are among the most shocking of the day. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon, the Department of Defense headquarters in Washington, District of Columbia. The political capital of the United States was also hit, reinforcing the feeling that the country was the target of a coordinated and highly effective large-scale attack. Minutes later, at 9:59, the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed, disintegrating in a matter of seconds into a cloud of dust and debris that completely covered lower Manhattan. The fall of the first tower left the world paralyzed. The cameras captured the impossible image of a building over 400 meters tall collapsing as if it had been made of sand. The rescuers who were already in the area were trapped under tons of steel and concrete. There was total alarm, screams, sirens, and ashes filled the air. At 10:03, a fourth plane, United Airlines Flight 93, crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. It was later revealed that passengers tried to regain control of the aircraft. After discovering through phone calls what had happened in New York and Washington, their actions stopped the plane from reaching its target, which investigations say was likely the Capitol or White House. Finally, at 10:28 in the morning, the North Tower, the first one to be hit, also collapsed. In less than 2 hours, those two towers that had been fought for so hard to exist had disappeared from the skyline. The emotional impact was immediate and global. In newspaper newsrooms and television studios, stunned journalists kept repeating a phrase that became common that day. It looks like a movie, but it's real. For millions of people, the images really did remind them of a Hollywood production, but it was the harsh reality broadcast minute by minute. That day, United States airspace was closed for the first time ever. All commercial flights were suspended and thousands of planes were diverted to airports in Canada and other countries. The government immediately activated security protocols never seen before. Meanwhile, the population stayed glued to their screens, trying to understand what happened and who could have carried out such an attack. September 11, 2001 resulted in nearly 3,000 deaths and over 6,000 injuries. At 8:30 p.m. that day, then-President Bush addressed his country and the entire world to say that the United States was committed to pursuing peace, freedom, and justice. Meanwhile, a new patriotism was taking shape to begin a crusade that, in his words, aimed to confront terror itself. Others began to see certain cracks in the official discourse. And the truth is, amid the rubble, the people's trust had crumbled too. The feeling of vulnerability, that nothing would ever be the same again, settled into the collective consciousness. Yes, but doubts also settled in, declared Kair Veseras. 1. One of the earliest and still controversial series is the one concerning prior intelligence. Could the attack have been anticipated by United States security agencies or those of other countries? Almost immediately, journalists, analysts, and government critics began reviewing documents, reports, and statements that suggested there were warnings before the attack. The official narrative suggested a surprise attack by Al-Qaeda, but soon reports began to surface saying otherwise. Congress would admit there were communication and coordination failures between agencies like the CIA and FBI. Testimony from several former agents showed that in the months before the attack, there were signs something significant was being planned. It was even revealed that some of the future hijackers were already under investigation, but the information was never shared between the agencies. This disconnect led to the idea that, at least in part, the attack was not a complete surprise, but rather a catastrophe that could have been prevented. Or is it that the United States itself wanted it to happen? We're going to get to that point. The key point now is that international warnings started appearing simultaneously. Governments like Israel, Germany, and Russia reported that they had sent warnings to North America about possible aerial attacks. The existence of these warnings, combined with the lack of visible reaction, strengthened suspicions that the authorities had received multiple signals, but that these were not addressed with the required urgency. In 2000, Hamed Ressam planned to fly explosives from Canada to Los Angeles on a Boeing 747. He was arrested before he could get away with it. This showed security agencies already knew terrorists were interested in using commercial planes for mass attacks. The official version says limited human and technological resources were a key factor. Tracking all possible suspects was dangerous, practically impossible, and mass communication monitoring systems were not yet fully deployed. Intelligence relied heavily on human reports and pattern analysis, which, although they indicated suspicious activity, did not allow all the dots to be connected in time. The combination of ignored warnings, compartmentalization of information, and inadequate security protocols created an ideal breeding ground. To this was added a disturbing detail. Before September 11, there were unusual financial activities involving airlines like United Airlines and American Airlines. Large amounts of put options, transactions that profit when a stock's price falls, were recorded on Wall Street. This led people to believe that certain investors knew something was going to happen. Several agencies investigated this point, concluding that there was no definitive evidence that these trades were linked to the attacks. However, questions remained in the public opinion. The echo of all this evidence fueled one of the first theories that emerged about September 11th, that the United States government, or at least a faction within the intelligence department, knew the attack was going to happen and allowed it to happen so it could serve as an excuse to later invade the Middle East. According to none. Among the many theories that emerged after September 11, none generated as much debate as the one that claims the Twin Towers did not collapse solely because of the impact of the planes and the subsequent fires, but were brought down by a carefully planned, controlled demolition. This idea, despite its controversy, became central to the discussion because visual, testimonial, and technical elements appeared to challenge the official explanation. The live images broadcast that day showed the world the moment when the towers collapsed in on themselves in a matter of seconds. For many, the way the collapse happened, fast and symmetrical, with a cloud of dust spreading in all directions, immediately evoked the look of a demolition. Intentional. Architects, engineers, and firefighters interviewed by media reported secondary explosions, loud noises before the collapse, and flashes on the doomed floors. The case of World Trade Center 7 added more fuel to the fire. This building, also known as World Trade Center 7, was not hit by any plane, although it did suffer damage from the debris of the towers and from fires that lasted for hours. However, its collapse, recorded at 5:20 p.m. that day, left even cautious observers perplexed. World Trade Center 7 came down in an almost vertical and uniform fall, at a speed that some engineers described as close to free fall. In fact, in certain sections. For supporters of the demolition theory, this fact was clear evidence of the use of explosives. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, the agency in charge of investigating the collapse, concluded years later that the fall of World Trade Center 7 was the result of a structural failure caused by uncontrolled fires that weakened beams. Criticism. According to their report, it was the first time in history that a steel skyscraper collapsed in that way because of fire. For many, that explanation only reinforced their suspicions. How was it possible that an unprecedented phenomenon happened right there, in that place, at that moment, and then never happened again? Another frequently cited element was the presence of nanothermite residue in the dust from the World Trade Center, a finding that some independent researchers claimed to have identified in collected samples. Nanothermite is a highly energetic material capable of cutting steel, which reinforced the hypothesis of a planned demolition. Clinging to their narrative, the authorities dismissed such claims, considering them errors of interpretation or a lack of scientific rigor. What? One way or another, the impact of the controlled demolition theory was enormous. The images of the collapse, seen over and over again, still fuel that suspicion today. For some, what the world witnessed live was not a terrorist attack, but a carefully designed spectacle meant to mark a turning point in contemporary history. On the other hand, the issue of the attack on the Pentagon also holds a very important place in this theory. As we noted, while cameras worldwide focused on New York, a third news story was breaking on television. A plane had crashed into the Pentagon, the very heart of the United States military apparatus. According to the official account, American Airlines Flight 77, a Boeing 757, had been hijacked and directed into the building, causing an explosion and the partial collapse of one of its sections. However, since the very day of the tragedy, doubts and theories have continued to generate debates. One of the most debated points was the extent of the damage. The first images showed a relatively small hole in the facade of the Pentagon. Many then wondered how? How could a large aircraft with a wingspan of over 38 meters penetrate in that way? No visible traces of wings or tail. The visible absence of these important fuselage remains at the site also raised suspicions. For some, it was incomprehensible that a plane of that size could almost completely disappear after the impact. The official explanation maintained that the force of the crash, combined with the fire caused by the fuel, would have pulverized much of the structure. But for the critics, this explanation was not convincing. Added to this was the issue of the recordings. Unlike what happened in New York, where multiple cameras captured the planes crashing into the Twin Towers, in the case of the Pentagon, only a few images from external security cameras were released. The official record showed a very brief and blurry sequence in which you could barely make out a silhouette before the explosion. This lack of graphic material fueled speculation that something was being hidden. For years, people demanded the release of all security footage from the area. but most of this material was never released, which reinforced the suspicions. Another factor behind alternative theories was the maneuver credited to hijacker Hani Hanjour. According to the official version, Hanjour, who was considered by his flight instructors to be a mediocre pilot, managed to execute a complex descending turn and crash the plane into the Pentagon at a very low altitude without missing the target. Critics of the official version argue that a maneuver of such precision would have required much more advanced training than he was known to have. For some, it seemed more plausible to think of a missile or a guided projectile, which would explain the magnitude of the damage and the absence of large airplane debris. But why? Who launched the missile and why? Was this perhaps an opportunity to destroy sensitive information in that building? The Pentagon attack also raised questions about the air defense system's response. The building is one of the most monitored and guarded spaces on the planet, protected by radars, fighter jets, and anti-missile systems. That a hijacked plane managed to penetrate the restricted airspace without being intercepted was seen by some as an inexplicable failure. The official version is that morning's chaos, poor agency coordination, and surprise were key factors. But for skeptics, that seemed almost impossible. On the other hand, when the attacks happened, the west wing of the Pentagon, which was the area that was hit, was conveniently under renovation and was almost empty. The renovations specifically aimed to strengthen it against potential explosive attacks. Those who support the inside job theory claim that this part of the building was chosen on purpose to minimize human and material losses. The result was an atmosphere filled with distrust. The government maintained there was no doubt. Flight 77 had been crashed into the Pentagon by the terrorists. On the other hand, the inconsistencies and gaps in the information created fertile ground for conspiracy theories. They claimed that the attack did not happen as it was told, or that it had even been manipulated. To cover up another truth, the tragedy at the Pentagon beyond the conflicting accounts became a symbol. For some, it was proof of the vulnerability of the United States to international terrorism. For others, it was at the heart of the suspicion that the official story of September 11 was not complete. But we still need to analyze what happened with the fourth flight involved. We're talking, of course, about Flight 93. United Airlines Flight 93 departed Newark for San Francisco. September 11, 2001 marks one of the most dramatic and studied attacks on the United States. While the other three planes reached their targets, Flight 93 became synonymous with resistance and the ability of the passengers to act under extreme circumstances. From takeoff, the passengers faced a violent hijacking. The terrorists, armed with knives and possibly fake explosives, took control of the cockpit. Testimonies obtained through phone calls describe in detail how the hijackers maneuvered to isolate the cabin crew and the passengers, establishing a control that seemed absolute. However, some passengers began to plan a counterattack, aware that their plane would be used as a weapon against Washington, District of Columbia, probably towards the Capitol or the White House. Among the most remembered are Top Beamer, Mark Bingham, Jeremy Glick, and Tom Barnett, who led the initiative to retake control of the plane. During calls to family and airline operators, they described the situation and coordinated with other passengers. Top Beamer's words, "Let's roll," have become a symbol of courage and action in the face of adversity. The passengers' resistance materialized in an attempt to storm the cockpit. According to the official version, the struggle caused the hijackers to lose control of the plane. This ultimately resulted in the plane crashing into an open field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, before reaching its original target. This outcome, although tragic, prevented an even greater catastrophe in the United States Capitol. The crash flight's technical details have undergone thorough analysis. The plane's trajectory, approach speed, and angle of impact indicate that there were deliberate maneuvers in the final minutes. This supports the version that the passengers managed to interfere with the hijackers' plans. However, some inconsistencies in the communication records and testimonies have been cited by conspiracy theorists to suggest that there may have been some external control or that the reports were adjusted to consolidate the heroic narrative. This is where a theory arises. What if Flight 93 was actually shot down by a missile launched by the United States Air Force? What if this whole story about the uprising on board was told in order to move the public? Well, at this point, this is where the calls from the people who were on that plane come in. And this is where there's something very interesting to analyze. Subscribe. One of the most moving and analyzed aspects of September 11th are the calls from passengers on the hijacked planes. These communications, made from onboard phones or cell phones during the flight, not only document the final moments of those who knew they would not survive, but have also been the subject of interpretation by all kinds of researchers. On the 4 flights involved, dozens of calls were recorded from passengers who managed to communicate with family members or airline staff. The calls help to understand the sequence of the hijackings, identify the number of terrorists and the type of weapons used, and convey the seriousness of the situation. Some argue that these details, transmitted with such precision, would be unlikely if the hijackings had been completely chaotic. Others question the consistency of the time recorded in the calls, pointing out that certain communications seem too lengthy or coordinated. For a violent hijacking scenario, where control of the plane was in the hands of dangerous people. Similarly, the technology used has been debated. Many calls were made, as we mentioned, from onboard phones, a system that in 2001 had significant limitations. The lines, for example, were slow and frequently interrupted. Multiple investigators attempted to make calls from the air in the days after September 11th. Statistics indicate that it was very difficult to get through or even get a signal. Was it all just a staged act to give this whole tragedy an epic feeling? Why? What was being swept under the rug? Now then, there were not only doubts about the performance of official agencies in the years leading up to the tragedy and during the attacks themselves. There was also a lot of talk about the actions these agencies took when conducting their investigations. The main agency clarifying what happened was the 9/11 Commission created in November 2002. From the beginning, the commission was the subject of criticism. First, because it began its work more than a year after the attacks, and second, because it was made up of members with possible conflicts of interest. The commission's own president, Thomas Keane, publicly acknowledged in 2004 that the commission was set up to fail. That statement became a powerful argument for skeptics. One of the most repeated criticisms is that the commission omitted key details. For example, the multiple air security failures that occurred that day were barely addressed. Nor was it convincingly explained how it was possible for 4 hijacked commercial planes to fly for almost 2 hours in United States airspace without being intercepted by the Air Force. The official explanation once again appealed to surprise and confusion, but for critics, it was an insufficient justification, especially considering the existing protocols. Confiscated videos and evidence have also been central. The FBI quickly collected dozens of security camera recordings near the Pentagon and other key locations, but only a few were made public. The government's secrecy with that material only multiplied the suspicions. Another striking element is the military exercises and drills that were taking place on the morning of September 11. That day, the North American Aerospace Defense Command was conducting drills that simulated airplane hijackings. For some, this would explain the confusion among air traffic controllers and the delay in the response. For others, however, it was just too perfect a coincidence, a distraction that allowed the attacks to be carried out more easily. Even the very financing of the attacks remains a subject shrouded in mystery. Although it was determined that the hijackers were mostly Saudi citizens, the commission avoided delving into possible financial links between the bin Laden family, figures from Saudi Arabia, and sectors of power in the United States. The 28 classified pages of the official report, which were only partially declassified in 2016, showed that there were connections that were never thoroughly explored. We will delve into those shortly. Altogether, all these irregularities created the sense that the government was not seeking to clarify what happened, but rather to control the narrative and quickly close the wound. And that perception, more than the technical evidence, was what solidified the idea that September 11 could have been something much more complex than an external attack. Beyond all this, when analyzing the hypothesis of a false flag operation, the core of the discussion centers on the possible motives. That is, what reasons would the United States government, or at least a faction within it, have to allow something like this to happen? The answer to all this for conspiracy theorists is the combination of geopolitical, social, and economic elements that emerged after the tragedy. And that's how our story returns to the beginning. How? Let's review the 1997 document project for the New American Century, written by a group of neoconservative intellectuals and politicians. Among them were figures who would later hold key positions in the administration of George W. Bush. In this text, the need for the United States to reaffirm its global leadership was outlined. This included the strategic control of resource-rich regions, such as the Middle East. However, they acknowledged that to achieve this, a catalyst would be necessary, a catastrophic, transformative event, like a new Pearl Harbor. Interesting, isn't it? Especially when we know that the immediate result of the attacks on the Twin Towers was in fact the war in Afghanistan. Just a month after the collapses, the United States launched Operation Enduring Freedom, with the stated goal of dismantling Al-Qaeda and overthrowing the Taliban regime that was giving them shelter. But many analysts argue that Afghanistan also offered a strategic control point in Central Asia, in addition to energy projects related to oil pipelines. Shortly after, in 2003, the invasion of Iraq took place, justified by the alleged possession of weapons of mass destruction by Saddam Hussein and his connection to terrorism. None of those weapons were found. The United States then claimed that the reason for the invasion was that intelligence services had information suggesting that Saddam Hussein maintained secret relations with Al-Qaeda. Recent reports show there was never a relationship. The fall of the Iraqi regime allowed the United States to position itself in a key area for oil supply. From the conspiratorial perspective, September 11th opened the door to these wars that, without such a powerful initial shock, would have faced much greater resistance from public opinion and in Congress. On the contrary, millions of Americans celebrated the deaths in those lands, convinced that an act of justice was being carried out. The impact was not only international. Within the United States itself, the attacks served as justification for a profound transformation of society. In 2001, the United States Patriot Act was passed, a law that gave the government unprecedented leeway to monitor its citizens, intercept communications, detain suspects without charge, and expand the powers of intelligence agencies. Protecting the country from new attacks became the main argument. For many critics, this was one of the fundamental objectives: to establish a permanent surveillance state. There were also clear economic benefits. The arms industry experienced rapid growth as the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq demanded enormous military resources. Companies linked to the energy and reconstruction sectors, such as Halliburton, former company of Vice President Dick Cheney, received multi-million-dollar contracts in the conflict zones. These connections fueled the suspicion that behind the tragedy there was a web of business interests. In this sense, the self-inflicted attack hypothesis goes beyond technical reasons for the tower's collapse and places it within a broader power structure. A political, military, and economic elite that would have used September 11th as a tool to reshape the world order. To promote wars, enrich corporations allied with the high command, and create a lasting model of extreme internal control. So, from this perspective, the tragedy was not an end in itself. The thousands of deaths and the immeasurable pain become, in the conspiratorial reading, the price paid to consolidate a new paradigm of domination. To fully understand this, we have to go further back and start analyzing several of the ambitions of the United States. The United States and oil. The relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia began to take shape in the first half of the 20th century when oil became a strategic resource for the global economy and politics. In 1933, King Abdulaziz ibn Saud signed an agreement with the American company Standard Oil of California, which obtained concessions to explore for oil in the eastern region of the country. Soon after, SoCal formed a subsidiary named California Arabian Standard Oil Company, later renamed Arabian American Oil Company in 1944. This company was key in the exploitation of Saudi oil fields and in bringing American capital and technology into the Arabian Peninsula. In 1938, the first major oil field in Dammam was discovered. This marked the beginning of intensive exploitation that quickly made Saudi Arabia one of the world's leading crude oil producers. During World War II, the strategic importance of Saudi oil became evident. In 1945, President Franklin D. Roosevelt met with King Abdulaziz aboard the United States ship Quincy in the Suez Canal, sealing a tacit agreement. American military support and security in return for priority access to Saudi oil. In the following decades, Aramco symbolized energy cooperation between the countries, solidifying the American economic and military presence. The relationship deepened significantly during the Cold War, when the United States saw Saudi Arabia not only as a supplier, but also as a strong ally against the influence of the communist bloc. Yes, before September 11, the relationship between the United States and the Arabs was very different from what we know today. It wasn't a formal alliance, but there were strategic and tactical ties that reflected American interests in the region. For example, one Rambo movie was dedicated, I quote, to the brave people of Afghanistan. As you can imagine, that dedication was later removed. During the 1980s, the United States supported the Afghan Mujahideen who were fighting against the Soviet invasion. This support included training, funding, and supplying weapons through the CIA, often channeled by allied countries such as Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. The Taliban as a group did not yet exist. Many of their future members were part of the combat context against the Soviets, so they indirectly benefited from United States assistance. After the Soviet withdrawal in the 1990s, the Taliban became Afghanistan's main power and set up a government in 1996. At that time, the United States did not officially recognize the Taliban, but maintained limited relations at the level of informal diplomacy and contacts with intermediaries. United States policy was focused on containing Iran's influence and controlling drug trafficking and regional extremism. During that period, the Taliban were seen as a tool for relative stability in a country devastated by years of civil war. Washington was interested in maintaining certain relations to facilitate the transit of humanitarian aid and protect strategic interests without getting directly involved in Afghan governance. However, this relationship changed significantly after the 1998 attack on United States embassies in Africa and the foiled attacks on international flights. It was then that it became clear that Al-Qaeda, based in Afghanistan under Taliban protection, represented a direct threat to the United States. From then on, the Taliban were viewed as an obstacle to be neutralized, especially if they did not hand over the leader of the aforementioned organization. You already know who we mean. Osama bin Laden is undoubtedly the most iconic figure of September 11th and one of the most controversial and discussed individuals. As Al-Qaeda's leader, he became the United States' top public enemy. But his story is marked by gaps, contradictions, and accounts that fuel speculation. Osama bin Laden was born in 1957 in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. He was one of the 54 children of Sheikh Mohammed bin Laden, an engineer and architect according to some sources. Just a simple farmer, as others say. What is clear about Osama's father is that he made a colossal fortune thanks to his connections with the Saudi royal family, who entrusted him with numerous public works. All of them were related to the construction of bases for the Americans, who came during those years to soak up oil. Osama had a childhood and youth full of privileges. He enjoyed a very good education and spent his days mingling with the sons of Saudi princes. At 13, his father died in a helicopter crash, leaving him $80 million. During the Cold War, Osama's mission was to raise funds to support Islamist resistance against Soviet occupation. So he and the Americans initially had a common enemy. Welcome, and Laden was in fact one of those men who, as we said, were trained by the CIA. They came to see him as a relentless, admired fighter. That's how he learned to move money through shell companies and tax havens, to prepare explosives, to hide, and to use encrypted codes to communicate. In 1980, he started recruiting pro-Afghan guerrillas and established his first camps. In 1989, the war in Afghanistan ended with the Soviet troops' defeat and withdrawal, and the war veterans would be recruited by Osama bin Laden to form his own group. But the definitive break between Osama bin Laden and his American allies occurred in 1990 when, as part of the preparations for the Gulf War, the United States deployed troops in Saudi Arabia. Foreseeing that after the Gulf War, the American presence in the country would grow until it became unmanageable, Osama bin Laden increased his calls to overthrow the Saudi monarchy. This decision first led to his exile in 1991 and 2 years later, the loss of his citizenship. Bin Laden moved to Sudan, where he stayed for 5 years until he was expelled due to United States pressure. In 1996, he settled in Afghanistan and soon came into contact with the leader of the newly established Taliban regime. After the September 11th attacks, his figure became omnipresent in the media and political speeches. He was credited with planning the attacks and mobilizing Al-Qaeda, making him the symbol of international terrorism. However, the lack of conclusive evidence and his long time in hiding raised doubts about his real whereabouts. At first, Al-Qaeda denied responsibility for the attack, but later contradicted itself. Some claim the video where bin Laden takes responsibility is a montage using a double. First of all, the man in the video bears little physical resemblance to bin Laden. Secondly, the fact that he is wearing a gold ring, which is forbidden by Islam. And thirdly, that he writes a note with his right hand, when in reality bin Laden is left-handed. For years, many wondered if the individual was truly in the mountains of Afghanistan and Pakistan, or if his image had been used as a propaganda tool. This uncertainty sparked theories that bin Laden was not actually captured or killed as reported, but that his death was fabricated or exaggerated for political reasons. On November 2, 2007, a Pakistani politician said that Osama bin Laden was killed. The British Broadcasting Corporation withheld this revelation from the original interview. The woman would be killed less than 2 months later. On January 31, 2010, El País and El Tiempo published an interview with Sultan Tarar, the right-hand man of fugitive Taliban leader Mullah Omar, in which he claims that bin Laden died of kidney cancer between May and June of 2002. However, on March 25, 2010, Osama bin Laden sent a warning to the United States government through an audio recording. He warned that the day the decision was made to execute his men, who had already been captured and were being tortured in Guantanamo, Al-Qaeda would kill all Americans in their custody. According to members of the United States Intelligence Service, the tape was genuine. By this time, bin Laden was already considered by many to be uncatchable. His videos, claiming responsibility for attacks or denying them, multiplied. There were both real and fake ones. His life was a mystery, until, thanks to secret informants, they found him, the operation that supposedly ended his life. Operation Neptune Spear, conducted on May 2, 2011, was kept completely secret from the outset. A United States Special Forces Commando, the Navy Sea, Air, and Land, S from Sea, Air, and Land Team 6, entered the residence where it was believed bin Laden was hiding. The official account states that after a short confrontation, the leader was killed and buried at sea from an aircraft carrier, according to civilian protocols. Despite the official details, several aspects of the operation have generated controversy. Some question the absence of public photographs of the body, arguing that this lack of tangible evidence allows doubt about his death to persist. Others note contradictions in the initial reports, including his resistance, the evacuation route, and the operation's duration. The speed with which his death was communicated worldwide, and the absolute certainty with which the events were described. They have also fueled the suspicion that the official narrative was carefully constructed to close an uncomfortable chapter. Furthermore, bin Laden's death coincided with a politically sensitive period for Barack Obama's administration, as he was seeking to consolidate his leadership during his first term. For conspiracy theorists, this operation had a symbolic component, turning the capture into a global media event. Conspiracy theories did not remain on the fringes of the internet. Soon they made their way into popular culture. Artists and celebrities began mentioning them in interviews and songs. Rapper Immortal Technique spoke about an inside job, while groups like The Coup and Public Enemy referenced September 11th in their music. Even media figures like Charlie Sheen and Rocio Donnell publicly questioned the official version, sparking major controversy. Television and cinema also echoed this. Series like The X-Files and its spin-off The Long Gunman. They would have planted in the 90s the idea of a government hiding dark secrets, and 9/11 fit perfectly into that logic of distrust. Later movies, like Side Gaze, delved deeper into the notion that the attacks were fabricated as part of a broader plan to establish a controlled world order. The internet was the fertile ground where these ideas flourished. At a time when social networks were just beginning to expand, September 11th became one of the first major viral topics of globalized conspiracy. Homemade videos, analyzing the collapses, blogs with alleged calculations, and debates on forums like Above, Top Secret, or Reddit exposed millions to these hypotheses. For many, these theories were not just paranoid ideas, but a way to explain the inexplicable. How could the most powerful military superpower in the world be breached? The idea that there might have been internal complicity offered a logical, though disturbing, answer to that question. Over time, these theories became an inseparable part of the collective memory. Even those who accepted the official version began to admit some things didn't add up. A seed of doubt that we can trust in the institutions. In this way, September 11th was also an event that transformed the way conspiracies circulated in contemporary society. It inaugurated a model that would later be replicated in other global events, from the 2008 financial crisis to the COVID-19 pandemic. This new worldview shaped new generations to be somewhat more apathetic toward the news, preferring not to dwell too much on the matter. And they finish with a simple and forceful, "Everyone lies." Some sociologists see that attitude as the root of today's widespread disbelief. But nothing is done to change what we don't like either. Everything seems to be stuck in a state of perpetual alienation. We know we live in a web of farces, but no one fights to get out. September 11th also inspired a whole new generation of artists who were deeply affected by these events. My Chemical Romance, for example, was born after its singer and founder looked for a way to deal with the pain he felt seeing other teenagers affected by these events. Spider-Man, by contrast, had to cut the Twin Towers from a movie scene. In fact, for a long time, the towers were erased from everywhere. It seemed as if they had never existed, even though paradoxically, they had ended up shaping reality as we know it. Critics highlight both the abuses by United States authorities and the many plunders in wars justified by attacks or self-attacks. There were also other shady deals that came out of that tragedy. Lana continues the story. Apart from leaving a trail of death and physical destruction, September 11th also meant a wave of financial gains that, for many, seemed too precise to be mere coincidences. From the collapse of the World Trade Center complex to the subsequent reconstruction, various economic sectors were directly or indirectly benefited, fueling the suspicions of those who support the inside job theory. First of all, the World Trade Center was insured against powerful terrorist attacks for billions of dollars. Larry Silverstein, who had acquired the lease for the complex just 6 weeks before the attacks, eventually received more than $4.5 billion in insurance compensation after a long legal battle. This amount is divided between payments for the destroyed buildings and for the breached lease contracts. For skeptics, it's hard to ignore that the tragedy coincided with such a significant financial benefit for a single owner. The New York reconstruction market was another point of interest. The demolition of the buildings and the clearing of the site required massive contracts for engineering, construction, and waste management companies. Meanwhile, the One World Trade Center project, the construction of the September 11th Memorial, and the remodeling of the financial district secured multi-million-dollar revenues for decades. Supporters of inside job theories see all this as forming a pattern. The tragedy created economic opportunities that otherwise would not have existed, benefiting private actors and the government itself in terms of strategic investment. After the Twin Towers fell, an unofficial movement emerged to revive these New York symbols. Under the Twin Towers Alliance, this initiative collected over 7,000 signatures from citizens supporting the iconic building's reconstruction. Among the visionaries who presented proposals was Donald Trump, who proposed a pair of towers called the World Trade Center Phoenix, a clear reference to the Twin Towers rising from their ashes. The design of these new twins aimed to maintain the characteristic silhouette of the originals, but with greater height, reinforced security measures, and larger windows. seeking a balance between tribute and modernity. Despite the initial enthusiasm, these ideas did not prosper. In 2003, the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation held a competition to determine the site's future. The first round, known as Preliminary Design Concepts, was widely rejected by the public, which forced a second, more open competition to be held in December 2002. At that stage, Daniel Libeskind's design was ultimately selected, paving the way for the reconstruction. The project culminated with the construction of One World Trade Center, initially called Freedom Tower. This skyscraper not only became the tallest in the Western Hemisphere, but by August 2022, it was also ranked as the 7th tallest in the world. However, the choice of design was not without controversy. Former New York Governor George Pataki was accused of influencing the process to favor a close friend. This sparked criticism about the transparency of the competition and possible political manipulation. The base of the tower, fortified and reinforced with strict security measures, also sparked debate. Some critics, like Deroyd Murdoch from the National Review, felt the structure's solidity and austerity reflected fear rather than freedom. This led them to ironically nickname it the Fear Tower, in contrast to the hopeful symbolism of its original name. In May 2011, a new scandal emerged after they were posted on the New York City Department of Finance website. Detailed floor plans of the tower. Citizens from the surrounding areas expressed their concern about the possible use of this information for future terrorist attacks. The then new chief of the New York Police Department, Ray Kelly, heightened the alert by describing One World Trade Center as the nation's #1 terrorist target. He emphasized that, despite its symbolism and modernity, the tower remained a vulnerable object and a reminder of the risks that still threaten the city. The latest major discovery about the Twin Towers is identifying 3 victims of the September 11, 2001 attacks, announced in August 2025. Thanks to advances in DNA sequencing technology, authorities were able to identify the remains of Ryan Fitzgerald, Barbara Keating, and a third person whose name is being withheld. These advances allow families to find closure, even though there are still about 1,100 victims who remain unidentified at Ground Zero. The United States was in Afghanistan for 19 years, 10 months, and 23 days. It ended August 30, 2021. The Taliban quickly returned to power, but that's another story. In the meantime, there were controversies over the gold stolen from central banks and the number of victims. Men, women, and children who were killed and lost everything. Soldiers on both sides were cannon fodder to carry out a plan as effective as it was unscrupulous. Are the Twin Towers then a tribute that the American powers decided to make in order to carry out their masterstroke? Was it an attack planned by themselves, or did they just make sure to let the attack happen without interfering and making things easier? Both scenarios are unsettling. We're talking about a government lying, yes, but we're also talking about a government giving up the lives of its citizens. What do you all think? Self-attack, or should we trust the official version? Either way, today, September 11th, is a double symbol that ultimately points to a single conclusion. If left unchecked, human ambition will leave the world in the most pitiful ruins.